Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are specific biological factors about your 20s and in the context of becoming out of a teenager that means that these years are particularly important for you to take the most experience you can get out of them. In terms of setup, we talk about how this is materialized in status quo, right? I think it's super important to note that there are other norms and there are other narratives surrounding age that necessarily exist, which means a lot of their material is already cut out of this, right? Because they say that corporations and things are the ones that push this. We say maybe, but also there's certain biological facts that pushes the rest of these narratives as well, which are things like other life stages, which are things like being in your 30s and working and starting a family, which are things like looking in your 60s, which is retirement and your second life, which means necessarily when these other narratives exist, your 20s are one of the unique parts of your life where you can actually take this opportunity to say, this is the best time of my life, right? Because the other narratives still exist and are taking up the rest of your years, right? Therefore, affirmative has to push that the narrative around 20s is the backbone to creating these other narratives if they want to run anything that goes against like unfair timelines and doing things out of order and things like this. Note that we do not have to say that this is the only narrative, just one that we do not regret, and we certainly do not regret it. In terms of how the narrative manifests, I think it encourages you to live life the best you can do in this time period, right? They note that this is scalable for everyone and in their context of their life. It tells you to go and get out of your comfort zone, to go on last minute trips, to cherish the positives of this time period, which we know is particularly important. Note this also manifests in people who are currently going into their 20s, but also the people in their 20s. Awesome. With that out of the way, how is this a positive narrative for people who are actually in teenagehood and are therefore most vulnerable to this narrative, right? I think it's important to note that people in their teen years do go through a period of significant stress as they do approach their 20s, right? Because teenage years are intrinsically a bit stressful time period. It manifests in society that there are ideas of things like moving out, about reinventing yourself, about things like high school bullying and the pressures that school puts on you to fit into mainstream society. There's things like your developing body, and note that mental health, having poor mental health is the most pernicious amongst this group. All of this compounds to promote the narrative that this is a time period of your life where you are struggling, and therefore there is an intrinsic need for you to have a positive narrative to be able to get you out of this struggling zone and into the next form of your life so you can flourish in this idea. How I think this manifests is firstly giving these teenagers and things hope, motivation to get there and make it through the struggles that I present to you, reassurance that this period of their life, which they may be struggling, will necessarily be worth it. And it gives you the idea that there is some form of a fresh chapter of your life, a form where you can create a better life for yourself. I think that was always such an important narrative to have in the context, right? Meaning in status quo, when you go into your 20s, people have hope that they can be themselves and they can reinvent themselves, which lacks on their side of the bench. Note the important impact when teens are restricted. For example, if you're closeted or have an overbearing family and things like this, because your mental health rates are necessarily probably likely poorer, that means that you are vulnerable and you need this thing to promote the idea that you can get out of this bad situation. The impacts of this is that these vulnerable people have a light at the end of the tunnel, right? For example, I know a friend who's gone through things like high school bullying so severe she could not get out of bed. With this narrative that pushes her when she went to university in the UK, this is where you can reinvent yourself and live a better life. I get constant phone calls about how that has manifested. But note in the counterfactual, in the absence of this narrative, note that there are also external forces that people are more likely to buy into in the absence of this narrative that we bring you, right? Things like the pull of capitalism telling them that they must work to fit in and have value in society, right? I think this in combination with the other timeline narratives that I bring you creates significantly worse outcomes, because you've probably struggled through these tumultuous teen words, and that means you never get to see the benefit of having a sense of freedom, and means you never get to benefit of growing your identity in a sphere that you are feeling free to do so. I think that was always going to be a pernicious harm and not taking accountability for the actual time zone, right? But thirdly, onto the value of your 20s life experience and why is it intrinsically in its nature so important? They say that the narrative is simply untrue that we're going to push to you. We say that the 20s are so uniquely critical to your life experiences for a few reasons, right? Firstly, there's just the biological need for physicality, right? For example, when you're in your 20s, you can go and do things like cliff diving or whatever, and your body can necessarily recover, and you can take time to actually be able to go and do these things again, something that you cannot do as you get older and your body starts to give up on you. Secondly, when you have a shared outlook, because of this narrative, I think it's manifested in society that your 20s, you're surrounded by people who do necessarily also want to make the best of their 20s, and I think this is incredibly important to being able to unlock those benefits of doing this together. Thirdly, you have a lack of responsibilities because it's unlikely that you have a significant family with children and things like that, or maybe a long-term relationship that you necessarily have to have the responsibility of providing for, which means this is a unique time period. But fourthly, also more connected than you ever will be through things like uni and high school and work. Note that you lose these over the years because you lose the ability to keep up these relationships as you move into the working sphere. With all that established, the narrative enforces this unique period of your life and allows you to engage in fresh experiences. Weigh this, even if this includes certain harms to people which they talk about, right? I think it's important to note that firstly, social norms exist, so people won't likely do anything too egregious like they try and push to you. But uniquely, if you do make a mistake, I think it's the best time to make this mistake because your body can recover, because you do not have responsibilities that it affects. But why these mistakes are in of themselves important is that it gives you life experience to actually carry with you throughout the later years of your life. So it's providing you lessons that you may not have gotten otherwise. But beyond this, there's necessary benefits to your mental health because you are allowed to feel self-fulfilled and allows your wants and needs to benefit yourself. Note, happiness is necessarily subjective, so the time of your life can mean different things to different people. So if it was in your needs to stay home and watch movies and that to you was the most fulfilling, I think this narrative also pushes that that is something that is good for you and you can unlock that self-fulfillment through that, right? So even if people respond by not doing things like crazy things, I think it's not exclusive that they have to be doing these crazy things and to actually feel satisfied. They can maximize their satisfaction in their own way. And before I go on, I'll take a point.
Obviously, people's mental health issues don't just appear on their 20th birthday. You're the guy coming in when their 20th doesn't feel like things be like.
Yeah, so this is my next point of substantive, right? Which is fourthly, coping with unsatisfactory times in your 20s. I think how the narrative has manifested does not mean that you are invalidated your struggles in totality, right? Note that pushes have about conversations opening up in mental health. We bring you this in a POI that was insufficiently responded to, which means that they necessarily present a falsehood when they tell you that people will not feel comfortable to come forward with their situations, because this is just empirically something that has never been had before in status quo, right? But additionally, people on either side in their 20s probably do go through tough times, but we uniquely offer them is hope for the rest of their 20s years, right? And even in times of need, they can take steps to still do things in the short term that has a chance to make them feel good and self-fulfilled. It means people do not feel bad about prioritizing themselves, especially those people in poor environments, right? And then when they tell you that people die when you tell them that your 20s must be good, I think that when you take into consideration that teens are most vulnerable to things like this, and when you remove the narrative that provides them hope, I think that's when you actually unlock that significant harm. I think that was something that you could never stand for. Uniquely, your 20s, you must take to be the time of your life to have a good life. Thanks, Neg.
I'd like to thank the first speaker, and would now like to welcome up the second speaker.
Ooh. Panel, in your 20s, you cannot perfect your life, but you can certainly fuck it up. So when side negative tells you that this is a particularly critical period in your development, a particularly critical period in your experience, they are right. That's why you didn't need this countervailing narrative, because there were a whole series of reasons we give you a guide that go unresponded to that you're likely to want to enjoy your 20s anyway. What you didn't need was an additional narrative on top of that, that one, said you must enjoy these maximally because this is the best time of your life. Note that when that narrative exists that this is the best time of your life, you have to seek to optimize this over all other things if you internalize this narrative. You have to believe that this is the most important time of your life. One, that is incredibly bad for like just hope for the future because you don't believe things can get better. So if they're shit, it was unclear that you did unlock the hope benefit that they give you on side negative. But we tell you secondly, that you're just going to make bad trade-offs with the future because you don't necessarily have the sort of full set of information that you would like to have in making good decisions. We tell you necessarily that you are going to be willing to take risks that you shouldn't need to take to try and achieve things that are beyond what is actually needed to make you happy because you believe you had to achieve this sort of perfect happiness, which was just never reasonable, which was never feasible. We tell you that it was much better to run horses for courses, to believe that your 20s were a time to grow and develop. Not that you couldn't enjoy your 20s, but there was absolutely no need for your 20s to be the best time of your life. What do they give us constructively on side negative? First, they tell us in direct response to us that there are other narratives around life. Panel, obviously, we accept that. But what this narrative precludes particularly is those being perceived as comparable to your 20s. The 20s being the best time of your life is a value judgment. We are saying there is nothing better. We are saying that your 60s could be for retirement and having fun with your kids. But we say that that's never as good as what you can do in your 20s. That's how being the best of something works. We can tell you that you can have a fulfilling career in your 30s and 40s, but it will never be as good as what you can do right now. That is an appalling narrative to run. It is incredibly valuable to have families in your 30s. It is great to do fulfilling work in your 40s. It is lovely to retire in your 80s. That is the breadth and complexity of the human experience. To deny that that was good, to deny that that could be as good as what happens right now, just after you're out of puberty, just when you turn 20, just when you're in university, was fundamentally stupid. I'll take side negative.
Other narratives only kick in once you're past your 20s. You're far more mature and you're far more capable to deal with that regret when you're in your 30s.
Okay, no. Firstly, one, you should obviously avoid things you're going to regret later in life. That's how regret works. It is a retrospective debate. You go back and you say, gee, I would have done this differently. Obviously, if they concede you'll regret this later in life, we should regret this narrative because that causes it. But secondly, you tell us that these other narratives only kick in when you're older. Obviously, that's not true because we explained to you a guide that there are a series of compelling reasons that it creates social stigma, that it reduces interest in people's aged care, that it also reduces interest in teenage healthcare, because for a whole series of reasons, people do not prioritize these things as highly. Obviously, that was harmful in a material sense. These narratives existed sort of as a general narrative in society. Note then that at the end of that, they didn't just kick in when you became 30, because when you were 19, you believed that the next 10 years were going to be the best years of your life. You also believed that in 20 years' time, it would never be as good as it was about to be. So the next thing they tell you is that you go and do lots of things like last-minute trips and enjoy your life. Panel, the incentive to go on last-minute trips isn't because it's like, this is the best time of your life. It's because you want to have fun with your friends. It's because you enjoy drinking alcohol. It's because you enjoy like being with people who make you happy. Note that the comparative then in this debate that we tell you to no response is that this is likely to tip you into a set of worse behaviors because you're going to go on a night out and there was going to be things like peer pressure to do drugs and, take substances from people you might not know. And a way that pressure manifests in this debate is to say, well, this is the best time of my life. I must absolutely maximize it. You are going to be perfectly happy. You are going to be perfectly safe going on those last-minute trips with your friends on either side of this debate. This debate took place and changed where that peer pressure was unlocked uniquely harmfully. Constructively, then, they give us three things in this debate on side negative. Firstly, they tell you that this narrative is needed to countervail teenage struggles. Firstly, I would make the observation that the series of things that makes your 20s better than your teens are symmetrical in a lot of cases. You have independence. You're pursuing a new path. You've left school. In all those cases, like people being bullied in school, you're leaving school after your teenage years anyway. That set of hope and probability existed symmetrically in this debate. Where that symmetry breaks, panel, is for a group of people who don't necessarily get that same development when they move into their 20s. I tell you that there are people in conservative cultural contexts around the world who don't understand their identity fully, who haven't come out, who can't come out because of their cultural context, who cannot necessarily experience the full beauty of those 20s in that, they cannot experience the fullness of life at that age. What that consequently meant was this narrative wasn't needed to break that sort of create hope, because the reason that you were hopeful was you were ending your teenage years. The list of benefits you get from being in your 20s operated independent of this narrative, but the belief that this had to be the best time of your life didn't operate independently. So the next claim they make is that your 20s are uniquely critical for 5 reasons. The first reason they give you is you have biological advantage. Panel, the narrative that your biological advantage runs out when you're 20 is literally a harm of this narrative, because people's actual full biology doesn't develop until they're 30. For men, being 35 is actually when your body is strongest and toughest and most resilient. Note that their entire analysis on this point is a consequence of this harmful narrative that we explained, because we shouldn't need to prioritize doing every single thing in your 20s. You go cliff diving in your 20s because you can never do it again. Obviously, that's going to mean you have to make trade-offs with other things you enjoy. You can do this later in life when you have more time, and it's going to be equally as enjoyable. Secondly, they tell you that there's a shared outlook. Panel, this is perhaps where they lose the debate most convincingly on side negative, because we tell you at Guide to No Response that there are a series of people who can never engage in this narrative. There are a series of people for whom their 20s will never be enjoyable, whether it is because you have to hide your identity, whether it is because you are under financial stress, whether it is because you are at university and you're not sure about what you're doing and you don't know what your life is going to look like. There are a series of people who can never engage in this narrative, and these were the ones who were most vulnerable to begin with and are now excluded from this shared outlook. You get a majoritarian dominant outlook which excludes the most vulnerable 20-year-olds. That was going to be incredibly harmful for side negative. The next thing they tell you is you have a lack of responsibility. I'm going to flip that in a second. The next thing they say is that you're more connected. But panel, this is true without the narrative. You're probably at university, you're probably at all these places, you've just finished school, you have these connections. We explained to you the incentive to maintain those connections operates the same on both sides of this debate. The last claim they make, which is incredibly harmful, is that mistakes are good. Panel, I would observe, just as I observed at the top of this speech, that you cannot do one single thing in your 20s to make your life perfect. But you can do one single thing in your 20s to ruin your life. You can take a substance, you can overdose on that substance and die. Obviously, that's the worst harm. But you can get into credit card debt. You can get into mountains and mountains of HEX debt, which mean, one, not only do you have to pay that off the rest of your life, but secondarily, you can't go and do other courses later that you enjoy more when you know more about yourself. You're obviously going to preclude your future set of opportunities by maximizing them in your 20s. Note that the consequence of that analysis was that these mistakes were likely to be much worse than they are, because their consequences can fuck up your future. They cannot make you perfect. I just realized the VST's here and I've said fuck like 10 times. Apologies. The last claim they make then is that they try and flip our exclusion material. And the way they get around this is with Sans' really weird POI, because this is obviously a debate where something changes in the world, panel. Just because we have awareness of mental health right now, what we explain to you is that this is a narrative which contributes to bad mental health. We would have less bad mental health outcomes without this narrative. Obviously, we can say that there is some awareness in status quo and also observe that it would be better without this narrative. The last claim is that people go through tough times. We do not know why this narrative creates more hope when you are a 28-year-old with no particular future outlook because you wasted your 20s getting high, not looking forward to your future. Note that when you were in that position, you were uniquely unable to get out of it with this narrative, and we were so proud to affirm.
My 14-year-old sister struggles with a lot in life. She probably has more problems than most people in their 20s in this room. She goes to a school that is incredibly antagonistic to her existence, where people quite literally yell racial slurs at her on a daily basis. They insensibly bully her for things that she cannot control, and they make her very insecure. The most I can ever do when talking to her is tell her, hey, my teens were pretty shit too. My 20s are much better. You'll be out of there soon enough. and then you'll be able to access all life has to offer. This was precisely what other people told me too, and it might seem extremely minuscule, but it did make me go, hey, let me at least do really well in high school, get into a decent uni, and see what my 20s are about. Ending your teenage years does not mean you immediately have hope for the future, as affirmative seems to suggest, because on our side, it is a possibility that life could be so much better, will not just be a continuation of your 20s or just slightly better than your 20s, which does not explain how that gives you hope entering into your 20s, that actually uniquely empowers all of these people in these situations. So 3 things in this speech. First, how does this narrative manifest and the counterfactual? Secondly, why is this good for people approaching their 20s? And thirdly, why is this good for when you are in your 20s and after? So first, how does this narrative manifest and the counterfactual? And I would note that all of the harms pushed by us by affirmative are just contingent on you believing that, the narrative manifests in incredibly bad ways. So first, we can just say that this narrative can manifest in nuanced ways, and that deals with all of their content on risks. Because maybe it looks like having as much fun as possible, but would also note that it can look at like many different ways, because people's perception of a good time are obviously colored by experiences that they've had early on in life. If you're not taking drugs in your teens, not unclear why, in order to have a good time in your 20s, you'd feel like you need to do that specific thing. I would note that like for my specific experience, my idea of having a good time is just going to the cinema and enjoying life and being around my friends and things like that, and not having people, do incredibly antagonistic things towards me. And so I'll just note that people's idea of having the best time of their life is incredibly colored by experiences that they've had in the past. So it's unclear why every single person has the most extreme perception of having a good time. If you do not believe every single person in this room is a drug addict, you cannot believe the characterization from affirmative. In fact, I would question whether anyone in this room is a drug addict, and as a consequence, would say that their case completely falls. And so we just think that in terms of taking risks in general, there's obviously a barrier to taking those risks, because this coexists alongside conservative pressures. This coexists alongside rationality that people have. Like, if I jump off this cliff, I'm going to die, so I'm not going to take that risk. And as a consequence, we think that the worst of their harms never accrue. Secondly, we just told you that this is not the only narrative that ever exists about your life. And those other narratives that they think are incredibly harmful continue to exist. For example, they point to the idea that women will feel pressured to feel bad in their 30s because the best of their years are gone and now they have to give birth and things like that. But obviously, this is a narrative that also continues to exist on their side, just absent of the fact that you had a really good 20s that you enjoyed, because women would always be pressured to be mothers, will always be pressured to be in a home, because it benefits society for women to exist in that specific capacity. We know that all of those other harmful narratives that make people feel bad later on in life continue to exist. They just exist independently of this narrative that makes you feel happy in your 20s. That's incredibly bad. At least for our side, women feel good in their 20s, feel like they actually should capitalize on this moment and have as much fun as possible. That never happens to women on their side. Instead, they're simply preparing themselves for motherhood in their 30s, thinking that they cannot have a whole era, whatever else other women do in their 20s nowadays. That is just something that we uniquely have on our side. Women are incredibly restricted. We give them more liberation on our side. Thirdly, we just think that this narrative does not manifest in ways that make people believe you can only ever have a good time in your 20s, and you can never feel bad at any specific moment. Because obviously mental health awareness has coexisted alongside this. We brought you this at first, but we also think that people haven't felt comfortable about talking about their mental health for myriad of reasons, like the patriarchy, like the fact that mental health has been demonized for a variety of reasons. Those have nothing to do with you having to feel good about your 20s. That is just the structure of society. And we would also say that this actually just makes you feel more comfortable to talk to your friends when you're having a bad time, because you think that you do deserve to feel good. You do deserve to feel amazing in your 20s. So when you're having a really bad time in your 20s, you do talk to your friend. If you talk to your friends under the existence of this narrative, which is the status quo, then you just have to believe us. If you believe that you're more inclined to reach out in therapy, if you believe that you should be having a good time and that is something you deserve in life, then you should obviously side with negative. We think more people believe that they deserve happiness. That is precisely what leads them to actually seek out these avenues of connection, like therapy, like talking to their friends. I'll take that point now.
We do not need to defend the narrative that your 20s suck. Obviously, we can support hope for the future. Why do you think that shouldn't exist for anyone over the age of 29?
Here's the thing. You basically, concurrently, obviously having the happiest moment in your 20s does not mean you do not have happiness any other point past your 20s. For example, people are often told the happiest day of your life is your wedding day, whatever. That does not mean the rest of your life is unhappy, loveless marriage. Obviously, that just means you're particularly happy in this moment. You have less excitement about things later on in life, but you can still be happy. And so I think that completely destroys that. And lastly, we just think that it is just harder on the counterfactual because they seem to pose that the counterfactual is having fun every day in your life. That is incredibly unlikely. It is probably just to grind into your 20s because the 30s are also when you have to be a mother. 40s are when you have to take care of like your 18-year-old kids. 60s are when you have to retire and things like that. So it's just unlikely that you're told to have fun at every day of your life. In the counterfactual, you're probably just depressed in your 20s on their side of the bench. We give people the support structures to get out of that depression. So secondly, on why this is good for people approaching their 20s, I already covered this in my intro, but I'm just going to wait here. And so I think that even if this narrative is disempowering for other groups, obviously this is most important for teenagers because they're just the most vulnerable people in this debate. First, they have not developed the internal capacity to cope with bad life circumstances. They do not have good support networks in many instances. They do not have people to talk to. And second of all, we think that we just give them a silver lining for life that is quite unique to our side of the debate. And we allow them to, we propel them into a stage of life that like allows them to accrue all of the experiences that allow them to cope with sadness and unhappiness later on in life. And I think that means that they are in a stakeholder you should care about, especially in this debate, relative to everyone else who is in their 30s, who has friends, who can go to like the mental health clinic at their university and things like that. If they're having a bad time, teenagers do not have access to these support structures, so you should uniquely care about them. Lastly, on why this is good for you when you are actually in your 20s. And I think that this is just good because you're able to let go of your past identity. And in many instances, this is not an identity you chose for yourself. It was often imposed by you, by other societal constraints and things like that. They tell us in some instances, you're still restricted in those societal constraints, and we feel bad for those people. But that does not mean the rest of everyone else who is able to escape those circumstances momentarily should not have the ability to actually discover what it is about themselves, or their identity, and actually acquire personhood in that instance. Because we think we uniquely give people the opportunity to do things that are important to them becoming an autonomous individual. So you reach out to those people that you would have never otherwise talked to. You do those things, you like talk to people, you go to events that you would never have done otherwise because you think you should be having the best time of your life. And that's what allows you to accrue all of the experiences to allow yourself to determine your identity. Maybe you make some mistakes along the way, but that's fine because you at least know who you are. And those mistakes are obviously mistakes in the context of you developing into a full person, which they never prove that you do because you are still caged into the identity that you were born into, that was imposed to you by society. You were never allowed to explore something that we do when we hit your 20s. So for all of those reasons, I've never been prouder to oppose. Vote negative. Wait, do I need to click anything? No. Okay. Cool. My speech will start 3, 2, 1. I think the exact reason why the next team is losing this debate is because of the material they gave you at one end. They tell you 20s is probably really unique because you have the best physical capacity, because you're most likely going to connect with people who has a relationship in high school. I think that's exactly the reason why they lose, because my life doesn't just stop at when I'm 29 years old. I want to live until like 80 years old or like 90 years old. That basically means I want to climb mountain when I'm like, 33 or like 34.
far. I also want to be like, oh, like, I just want to hear the narrative on like, this is young people's sport. You shouldn't attend this. You're really old. I think that's the counterfactual they're trying to defend. But secondly, I also want to date more men as possible, right? I just don't want to be saying that, oh, like, you're no longer young anymore. Like, you're no longer valuable in the market anymore. And I just like stop doing things like, finding better sexual partner like that. I think that's exactly the harm, right? Because I think if enjoying life is really important, if that is a metric they're prioritizing in this debate, then we maximize like the length of this period of time that you can actually enjoy your life, because like their happiness only limited to like 10 years at best, but the happiness that is likely going to exist under our side are likely going to be very much more compared to them. That's the reason why we're winning this debate. The first thing I want to talk about in my speech then is like whether those teenagers who has like really bad life and they have traumas, and whether they actually need this narrative in the first place. And then the number one, they try to claim that, oh, like they will have a better life, and then this gives them a hope. Number one, I think there is just like lots of mechanization on why your life is just dramatically improved when you turn into your 20s. People who suffer from like things like bullying in the school are likely going to, be more sensitive, are likely going to feel they're less connected with other people because other people don't experience the same trauma as they did in the past. And that's exactly the reason why you're also likely going to be, lacking of social skills. They're likely going to be perceived as outcasts when even after they enroll into university. And that's exactly the reason why it's unsure why their life just suddenly becomes so much better comparing to status quo. And then like, if they didn't prove this premise, then it's just like really meaningless on like, why do you give them hope? Because I think what is worse is that the time when you tell like those kids be like, oh, 20s it's really good, university is really good, and when you turn out, it's just like your university life is like quite shit in general, which basically means that you give them hope and you deprive the hope from them. That's what this narrative is doing in the status quo. I think that is going to make the whole thing worse in the counterfactual. But thirdly, I just want to be charitable on like taking the best case of this narrative, saying that, oh, like maybe you gave them hope and this is quite important. The main problem is this argument. It's just like, it's never like mutually exclusive in this debate, because the counterfactual is not like you don't have narrative at all. The counterfactual we're defending is like someone stands up and saying that, oh, like not only your 20s is the best of your life, you're probably also going to be having like really valuable 30s, or like having really valuable like 40 years old your life, which basically means like the counterfactual is just not like, you only have like 20-year-old friend telling you, oh, like university is going to be good, you're going to have a good life. You have like someone that is 30 years old telling you that, oh, you have like quite promising your life when you turn into like, corporations, you're likely going to earn money, you're likely going to be able to be independent and supporting yourself. And like, or like someone that is 40 years old or like 50 years old telling you that your life is good in general. I think that just turns this argument against them, because in general, you have more people telling you your life is good and they're on our side, which means that we provide more hope to those teenagers in general. Now, let's talk about like, whether this narrative is likely going to cause harm, like because they're trying to wash the comparative, trying to say, oh no, like other narrative exists, you're also likely going to gain those benefits in the status quo. And then note that the only examples throughout this negative team is trying to say is like, oh, maybe at the time when you get wedding, like get married, this is going to be a really good moment in your life. But yeah, maybe this is true. But then I think the the more like compelling narrative existing in the status quo is like, you have midlife crisis, you need to take care of your children, you need to, like take care of your parents who are getting old and they actually need more medical care in general. You need to spend like a huge amount of money in your life, and that's exactly the reason why you're more likely going to feel pressure, you're more likely going to feel anxiety in general. And that's exactly the reason why you need this narrative to like stop, and you need someone in the counterfactual to telling you that no, like this is not actually going to be true. I think the second thing to note here is just like, even if this exists, like I think the second affirmative already told you that this norm is probably also likely going to reduce the effectiveness of all the other norms existing in the society, which means that the more popular they want this narrative to exist in the status quo, the larger harm will occur, or like the larger effect, like reducing the effectiveness of other like norms existing in the society. Let's then be more specific on what actually, like, what is the harm? What does the harm look like? the first thing they're trying to talk about is like a mental health issue. And then like they say, oh, you already gain awareness. But number one, we say we reduce the cause of mental health issue in the very first place. And that's just way much more efficient because like the only response was quite generic on saying that, oh, there are social movement, pay attention to it. But number one, if you get long-term depression, it's extremely hard for you to cure in the very first place. So even if you get societal support, it's way much better for you to not to get so much anxiety, not to get so much pressure in the very first place. But number two, it's also really costly, right? If you go to like a therapist session, it costs you like $900 per hour. I think that's exactly the reason why they block all those people who come in from a marginalized community who actually need those support. I would rather live in the world where somebody tell you that, no, like your 20s, even if your 20s is miserable, you're probably likely going to change that in the future. You should be hopeful for your future. I think that's exactly the reason why I'm less likely going to get depression and the other side. Before I move on, yes.
But harmful narratives, things like capitalism, telling you to do nothing but work in your 20s, how do you counteract that without a narrative and code such as the one with Baraka?
No, I don't think it's necessarily bad because like if like the society tell you, oh, like you should work in your 20s. Now, obviously working in your 20s is not a bad thing in general. Like getting more internship means like you're more likely going to explore your life in depth compared to in general. Like if you feel like, oh, enjoy your life in your 20s, just like go for partying or like go to, you know, like chit chatting with your friends. That's probably like less productive on like personal growth in general. And it also means that you're more likely going to feel midlife crisis at the time when you turn 30, because at the time, like when you get more experience on your other side, this means that you have more capacity to deal with like a lot more things in your life in general in the future. If you think life in general is just going to get worse, we make you way much better prepared for this and the other side. But secondly, let's just talk about why this narrative is really, really harmful in general. I think that like they're trying to say is like, oh, like you're not going to feel bad because this is not the main narrative that's causing the social problem or like social discrimination on people. Note here, this is the logical premise for all the other narrative to exist, which basically means that you don't have the norm of like left behind women or like women turning 40s are less valuable in the first place if this norm doesn't exist, because you don't only perceive women are valuable at their 20s. You see like, oh, they probably have their prime when they're turning 40 years old. That's exactly the reason why without this narrative, those other narratives that is really harmful also reduce its effectiveness in general. I want to conclude like my speech in like one simple example. At a time when Hannah Gatsby stands up in her comedy show and said that she was raped at like 17 years old, she was abused by two men on the street when she turned 22 years old, it's extremely unlikely going to be like beneficial for her to believe in this narrative rather than just directly say that no, like every single part of your life actually matters. For all those reasons, so proud to affirm.
And now I would welcome.
When I was 16, I moved to America and moved high schools in America, not knowing anyone there, not understanding how the American system worked. But I still had to suffer from stress, academic, family, career stress, and a lot of anxiety as well. What got me through what was objectively perhaps one of the toughest periods of my life was knowing that in my 20s, things would get better. That perhaps that was when I was going to have the most fun. And I think that's deeply valuable, not just to people like me, but to millions and millions of other people that are currently going through the same situations in high schools today. And I think what this team suggests to you, that these are false promises, even if you believe them to be false promises, doesn't take away from the fact that these false promises do give real hope to people that are going through the most vulnerable periods of their time. And that in and of itself is valuable. What we told you from side negative, though, was bold, was daring, that these weren't false promises, that things did get better. And it was this narrative that made you feel like things got better. And that's precisely why you were better off in our world and you weren't in theirs. The first thing I want to do on account of just some just on account of some housekeeping things on meta stuff, is to just point out that this team never mechanized to you why their counterfactual would be one, where people would think that all of the years of their lives are going to be good. I think a more reasonable counterfactual, which we've been telling you down the bench, and that one that you ought to believe, is that this is true comparatively to what stage of your life you're in. And this will become really important later down when I tell you how this manifests, especially for teenagers who feel like the world is caving in on them. But just as a point of note that they never give you any mechanization. They wanted to talk about us not mechanizing. It was them that forgot to do it at first. Let's first talk about this list of harms this team has told us. The first thing they tell you at Guy is that you will drink 15 shots instead of 5, and at Xavier, they say you're going to OD on drugs. I just think this is silly, right? I think obviously you have other narratives that coexist with this one, which tells you, hey, maybe you shouldn't peer pressure people into drinking. That's why we have equity, hello Guy, in debates that tell you that you ought not to peer pressure people. Secondly, we tell you that people have their own assessments of risk. They have their own level of risk appetite. So obviously, if I am someone that doesn't like drinking, or if I'm someone that's particularly aware of drinking, I would rather not take 15 shots instead of 5. I think all of those things probably suggest to you that on a balance of probabilities, people aren't overdosing, people aren't turning into alcoholics or drug addicts. Just take a look around you. None of us are. Secondly, they suggest to you that you lose hope at the end of your 20s, and that's incredibly bad. What I want you to compare that to is losing hope at 18 or 19, as opposed to when you're 28 or 29. And we would suggest to you down the bench to no response or sufficient response is that your ability to deal with that stress is far lower when you're 19 or 18 or 17 than opposed to when you're 28 or 29. And we gave you several reasons to believe this. The first was access to resources, your ability to access better mental health care, better things from university doctors, et cetera, as opposed to ones where because you're a minor, you have to get access to that through your parents. That was obviously one. The second was just on maturity. You were older, you lived longer, you understood that life wasn't ending when you were 29. So even if you did feel a level of regret, it wasn't as substantial as a harm as the level of regret you face when you are 17 or 18, when you don't have that maturity, when you do feel like your life is going to end, when you do feel like the world is against you. Those feelings are far worse when you're younger as opposed to when you're older. That maturity tells you that this isn't as problematic. The third thing this team suggests is that women feel bad. Do I get it? Yes, they do. But as the source of that bad isn't uniquely this narrative. Never has this team ever pointed you to believing that this source of unhappiness comes from that. I would suggest to you on a more reasonable metric that this unhappiness comes from the patriarchy. Patriarchal norms that want to oppress women tell them that they ought to be mothers in their 30s or in their 20s. And I think those narratives continue to exist on their side. They never give you any mechanism to believe why this is a tipping point in those narratives actually pushing women into those roles in the first place. So as a reasonable person, you ought to believe that those pressures still exist. But secondly, I just think if that is true, that those pressures exist in their world, because you have an absence of the narrative that tells you to make the most out of your life in your 20s, because these are the best years of your life, you as a mother, as a consequence of the patriarchal norm, are less likely to do things like go out and try new things, go out and do daring experiences, go out and date more people or different kinds of people. Obviously, you're far more concerned about being a mother in their world than you are on ours. So obviously, you're far more victim to the patriarchy and far worse oppressed. The final thing this team suggests is that you exclude vulnerable people. And I think this is a bit this point misunderstands what we told you, which is that one, you're likely to which is to explain that yes, there are vulnerable people that won't enjoy their 20s to the same extent everyone else does. But happiness is subjective. You can sit down. Happiness is subjective. People experience happiness in different ways. For example, Lauren really likes partying. I don't. I like debating. So here I am, right? The reason this is important is because this narrative puts into perspective the kinds of lives people live when they're vulnerable, especially when they have a vulnerable teenage year. So when you are someone who was, for example, gay, living in a conservative society, when you leave out of your home, you're still better off than when you were inside your home. You still had more freedoms, for example, you had more independence, which meant that this narrative puts focus on the fact that you are better off now than you were then, which meant, if anything, we made vulnerable people better off because this narrative points you and focus and highlights the best things in your life. And just by virtue of you believing, oh, are these the best years of my life? Let's see what this looks like compared to everything I've lived so far. And when you compare it to the first teen years of your life, where life was comparatively far worse than when you were more independent and particularly oppressed and vulnerable, I think you're able to appreciate the little things in life that did make it far better. This team doesn't want to contend with that, but I would suggest that vulnerable people are far better on our side. Before I get onto the benefits and their responses to that, let's take you.
We're super happy for adults to tell troubled teens that things will get better. Could you please explain the difference between the word better and best?
Look, I think people will only tell you that these are going to be I think one, best is far more convincing to someone who's going through incredibly problematic times in their lives, especially when they're incredibly problematic things. Secondly, I think if you are to believe that if that is true and this narrative doesn't exist in your world, as a teen who's currently thinking that the world is against them, that everything is shit, you are likely to manifest this in bad ways. So you think things are only going to get worse. You need something as strong as telling you that these are the best years of your lives, not things that are going to get marginally better. What does better even mean, Xavier? Obviously, those things work far more impressively on our side than it does on theirs. And it does far more to actually counteract those negativities than it does on their side. So on a comparison, obviously this matters more. You can't just POI and hope you win that. You hope you win the debate. We told you a set of benefits that they do not respond to. The first is the benefit this means to teens. I think we've already explained to you why this is. There is enough mechanism to deal with it, and they haven't given substantial responses to those mechanisms for you to not believe those benefits manifest. But these are the most important stakeholders for the reason that they don't have the resources to deal with the stress, as opposed to people in their 28s or 29s. And I think that means that these are the most vulnerable stakeholder, and therefore the most important stakeholder you should consider in this debate. And that was a stakeholder that we uniquely catered to on our side. They did not. The second thing they suggest is that, mistakes are bad. Yes, mistakes are bad, but you are in your 20s. You're best able to deal with those mistakes. Your body can suffer from an OD, but still survive. If you're in your 50s, you might not survive an OD. I think those are real important life values and real important things that you learn from those things. That means that you have the kinds of experiences later on in your life to get through things and make better informed decisions when you come across the same set of choices later on in your life. This team wanted to suggest that you don't learn anything from your mistakes. Obviously, this team has apparently never made one, but most of us know that people make mistakes and people learn from them, and those learnings are inherently valuable, and that's incredibly good. Look, on our side, we make teenagers' lives better off. We give people hope, and this narrative coexists with a bunch of others we're incredibly proud to oppose.
Woo! Might as well there are no COIs in the one. Currently recording. It's just on Zoom. You are uncomfortable with being recorded. Just stop recording now. And I think you just pause it and